Welcome to this discussion on environmental terrorism with Professor Greg Rose. This webinar is hosted by UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust. I'm the legal director, Natasha Hausdorff. Now, the topic of environmental terrorism is particularly pertinent in a week where our Jewish members have just celebrated Tu B'Shvat, the holiday of the birthday of the trees, and increasingly it's known as Jewish Earth Day. It's also pertinent in light of the increasing phenomenon of terrorism targeting the natural world. Everything from Iranian involvement in the Emerald oil tanker spill to forest arson in Israel and the use of fire balloons and burning tyres across the Gaza border. Well, to grapple with how international law might deal with this and this phenomenon, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Rose, joining us very early in the morning from Australia. Professor Rose is a professor of law at the University of Wollangong, an expert in international law with experience conducting counterterrorism legal training and United Nations projects on the implementation of international environmental law. He's published widely on marine environmental and security matters. And outside the academy, Greg was head of the Environmental Law Unit at the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and was previously director of the Marine Resources Programme of FIELD, the Foundation for International Environmental Law and Development, where he was also the founding editor-in-chief of the Review of European Comparative and International Environmental Law. Professor Rose, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Natasha. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you for your kind introduction, and to UKLFI for this opportunity. Greetings to everybody who has joined us online, and I'm coming to you from Wollongong, a town south of Sydney, and the traditional home of the First Nations people of this area, the Wadi Wadi people, to whom I pay my respects. Today, I will be speaking on the subject of environmental terrorism. I'll share my screen so that we can follow the slideshow. Now, is that coming through?
It is indeed.
Thank you. So my objectives today are essentially to raise awareness of the phenomenon of environmental terrorism, to clarify and define it, to demonstrate there are gaps, major legal lacuna in dealing with it, and to suggest a potential legal solution. Environmental crimes are one of those things that sit at the intersection. There are many things that sit at the intersection of public international law concerning terrorism and the laws of armed conflict and international humanitarian law. Another area that I work in is detention in transnational military operations, where again, national laws apply in the stead of the Geneva Conventions when dealing with persons that fall outside of prisoner of war scope. So environmental crimes are a similar phenomenon in the context of terrorism and armed conflict. So first of all, what is terrorism? The threat or use of violence, generally criminal violence by persons, private persons, not in the context of armed conflict, to coerce a desired political behavior. The coerced persons are generally governments or international organizations, but may also be major companies or political actors. A general definition of terrorism, a comprehensive definition, doesn't yet exist. There's no comprehensive convention on terrorism, but rather a series of sector-specific international agreements that define particular acts. The most general of them is the International Convention for the Suppression of the Financing of Terrorism, which, because it deals with financing, cross-refers to the various sectoral conventions and says that collecting or providing funds that are to be used in such acts is to be prohibited by the states that are parties to the convention and to be prosecuted. But it also adds a little extra general definition as an act intended to cause death or serious bodily injury to a civilian in a situation where its nature or context is to intimidate a population or compel a government or an international organization to do or to abstain from doing any act. So that's as general as it gets when we're defining terrorism. That is coercion by means of death or serious injury to a civilian. It's necessary for us to understand the concept of environmental terrorism to distinguish it from related concepts. And just as the killing of a person may be the result of culpable and negligent driving, or of manslaughter, or of a homicide, actions can be categorized legally in several ways. And an action that is an environmental crime might also be an act of environmental terrorism, or in another context might be a war crime. So the picture we have here in the top right-hand corner is of the Bob Barker, a ship operated by Sea Shepherd, which harasses Japanese whaling vessels in the Southern Ocean, cutting nets or snaring propellers or throwing stink bombs or ramming. And that would be defined or definable, it's definitely controversial, but definable as eco-terrorism. So eco-terrorism is distinct from environmental terrorism. Eco-terrorism refers to acts of violence to coerce behavior in support of environmental policy causes, such as protection of natural forests from logging. And whereas this might seem to be the stuff of fantasy, the FBI has identified 2,000 such acts since 1979. That's about 50 per annum, one a week, just in the USA. They often involve minor acts of violence, like spiking trees with metal spikes that will injure loggers who are harvesting timber, monkey wrenching, which is sabotaging operations. It could be farm machinery or housing developments in sensitive lands. There was an interesting case of a rocket-propelled grenade fired into the French Super Phoenix fast breeder reactor in 1982 by somebody named Chaim Nissim, originally an Israeli who later became a member of Swiss parliament. But typically it'll be organizations like Extinction Rebellion, Earth Liberation Fund, or Earth First that might decide that the resort to violence is necessary to protect the environment. And that's to be contrasted with environmental terrorism, where the harm is to the environment rather than the objective to protect the environment. Then, of course, environmental crimes can occur without any political coercion motive. Straightforward environmental crime like the dumping of building waste in public parks or the discharge of effluent from factories into public streams. And those environmental crimes are not a binary analysis where it's environmental crime, not environmental terrorism. It may well be both, so that the political benefit of harming a target population is an added benefit of the costs saved or profits made through the environmental crime. The Israeli Zionist environmental group Regavim has documented cases of such environmental crimes across Israel and the West Bank, and I'd recommend that you look up Regavim, R-E-G-A-V-I-M. And another category, which I won't have time to address today, is war crimes, where disproportional measures are taken, or measures that target environmental assets, contrary to the laws of armed conflict, occur. And that's our second photo here, which is of an oil well, or oil wells, on fire in Kuwait when the Iraqi army under Saddam Hussein was forced to leave Kuwait. It deliberately caused 2 spills and detonated an estimated 1,250 oil wells, of which almost 600 were engulfed in flames. So that would be considered a war crime, in that there you had an international armed conflict, public international law applied, as compared to national law relating to environmental crimes, eco-terrorism, or environmental terrorism. The last item that was on that slide was ecocide, which I'll refer to later in this presentation, which is a proposed new category of environmental crime. Now, unfortunately, Israel is a testing station for terrorism, and we have the 1988 Convention on the Suppression of Acts Against Maritime Navigation, adopted after the Achille Lauro hijack by the PLO, in which one of the passengers, Leon Klinghoffer, was thrown overboard, and freedom was demanded and achieved for various PLO convicts in European countries. So similarly, we have an innovative form of terrorism emerging in Israel, which is environmental terrorism. And certainly it has been evident in the last 5 years more intensely. It's a growing phenomenon. In the photos here, you can see the forest fires over Jerusalem in August last year. And to the right, the burning of tyres across the Gaza border, causing air pollution and smoke screen. In the West Bank, it's common to burn tyres. Over 70,000 recently have been burned to smoke out the Jewish settlement of Eviatar near the Palestinian village of Beitar, and also at Kfar Kadum. So we have this occurring both in the West Bank and at the Gaza border, the phenomenon of deliberate creation of air pollution to intimidate civilians. Sewage is also used as a weapon of environmental terrorism. Untreated sewage, blood from meatworks, which in the West Bank, which involves the Judean mountains, flows from highland to lowland, polluting the Kishon and Alexander streams. And there are a range of complexities that apply to the installation of sewage treatment works, where the Palestinian Authority and villages have refused to be connected for political reasons that are seen as legitimating the Israeli occupation. But most alarming were the forest fires in 2016, which struck dozens of towns and forests and destroyed hundreds of homes in the 2016 Israeli summer. The government fire investigation authority investigated 80 fires, finding that 71 resulted from arson. And of those 90% that were the result of arson, they were ignited by Arabs who'd come from areas under the administration of the Palestinian Authority as a form of political coercion against Israel's Jewish population. We find increasingly there's controversy over Israeli forests and action taken against forests as tools of the Zionist project. which is particularly alarming in the week of the birthday of the trees. And then we come to marine environment. And so there are sewage aspects where Gaza's inadequate sewage treatment and again, complex reasons for that have resulted in the closure of the Ashdod desalination plant due to pollution that travels north along the coast of Israel from its southern borders. And there are increasing risks of targeting of the natural gas offshore installations off Israel's coast, which could generate further marine pollution, as we saw in the Deep Horizon incident in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. Although this is a good example of where the environmental pollution might be seen as an added benefit in the sense of environmental terrorism, with the primary target being not the environment, but the asset, the natural resources asset of the offshore installations. But I'm going to focus on the oil pollution that occurred in February last year along the entire Israeli coast as a result of the discharge of crude oil by a tanker called the Emerald. It was built in 2002. It was carrying 90,000 tons of crude oil and discharged about 1% of that 50 kilometers off the coast of southern Israel on the 1st or the early morning of the 2nd of February. And it took 2 weeks until that oil slick reached the Israeli coast and caused major damage. You can see there to the left a picture of the ship, the Emerald, and to the right some sea turtles that are slicked in oil. Here we have a picture of a 17-meter fin whale calf that died after ingesting oil and washed up on the dunes of the Nitzanim Evta Sea Marine Reserve in southern Israel. Other species affected were birds, amphibians, and other marine mammals. Spawning fish tend to recover more quickly from these kinds of environmental catastrophic events, but long-lived species such as turtles recover more slowly. There were also human impacts as a result of the oil slick. Tyres poisonous if ingested, and the volatile organic compounds are carcinogenic, and cleanup volunteers, several were hospitalized after inhaling toxic fumes. Swimming was suspended along Israeli beaches through the rest of the winter and were lifted in mid-spring in April. And of course, fisheries were closed and domestically produced Mediterranean seafood was banned for consumption. Israel is also seeking to meet the UN target of 10% of its waters being marine protected areas. And there are a series of marine parks and reserves along the Mediterranean coast, such as the one in the picture here, which were impacted. Over 120 tons of tar balls were collected from the Israeli shore, all the way from the south, from Ashkelon to Rosh HaNikra in the north. There were 10,000 volunteers that went into beach cleanup, and the estimated cost of cleanup was between $20 and $35 million US. The National Marine Division of the Israeli Ministry for Environment Protection conducted an investigation into the source of the oil spill, and it had excellent international cooperation for that purpose from REMPEC, the Regional Marine Pollution Emergency Response Center for the Mediterranean, located in Malta under the Barcelona Convention for the Protection of the Mediterranean Sea, which has a series of protocols under it, including one that deals with emergency pollution response. And that's what the Malta Center is established for. So REMPEC assisted with investigations, and 10 vessels were identified as being about 50 kilometers off the coast in the vicinity of the possible original position of the oil discharge. And they had the use of Eurosat satellite imagery to assist them, and data from the Mediterranean operational network of the Global Ocean Observing System, as well as feedback from other countries in the region, Egypt, Cyprus. So the initial suspicions focused upon a Greek vessel, the Minerva Helen, but after it docked in Piraeus in Greece and was given chemical analysis of its cargo, it was found to have a different chemical signature to the oil that slicked up on Israel's beaches. This picture, I give credit to T.M. El-Ghaziri and I.G. Bryden in The Circulation Pattern of the Mediterranean Sea, Issues for Modeler Consideration, which is a journal article in the Journal of Operational Oceanography, and shows the pattern of circulation in the Mediterranean Ocean. Mediterranean actually comes from the Latin Mediterranean. It was the middle of the earth, that sea where the earth was the Roman Empire. It was the center of the Roman Empire. And to the far left, you have the Straits of Gibraltar. So it opens to the Atlantic Ocean. It's a semi-enclosed sea in the terminology of the international law of the sea. But because it has such a narrow mouth, the exchange of Mediterranean seawater with the Atlantic Ocean occurs in full only every 14 years. And that water comes in mostly along the south coast, hits the Levant to the east, and then is turned in a gyre upwards to the north and comes out again across the north coast of the Mediterranean. And this map shows you various other subsidiary gyres that are created within the Mediterranean. And up to the north here, you have the Straits of Marmara leading into the Black Sea, which would have an even slower rate of freshwater recharge. So the circulation of currents in the Mediterranean are known and predictable. If you drop pollution into the ocean at the southeast corner, it will travel north, and therefore it was predictable that the oil pollution discharge 50 kilometers off the extreme south coast of Israel was going to travel north. In the end, it actually traveled past the north of Israel into the southern tip of Lebanon and as far as the city of Tyre. At the time, there was no tanker casualty in the ocean. There was no apparent transfer of cargo from one ship to another, and laboratory analysis of the oil indicated that it wasn't fuel, otherwise known as bunker oil, that might have been leaked into the bilge of the ship, but rather it was the actual crude oil cargo. Now, crude oil cargo is sometimes discharged when the tanks are being washed. It's meant to be discharged into port reception facilities, which costs money for the ship owner, and illegally, sometimes rogue operators will wash their tanks out into the ocean. However, in this case, the tanks were full and they weren't being washed out, and therefore it seems that the discharge was deliberate. It would have been deliberate even if it was just seeking to save money, but in this case, the suspicion was raised that it was deliberate in order to cause an oil slick. There was no trail of oil or tar along the passage of the vessel that was identified. So it was just a singular release. And again, that creates the suspicion that it wasn't malfunctioning equipment, but a deliberate discharge. That occurs in the context of the grey zone conflict between Iran and Israel that I'll speak of shortly. This graphic, credit goes to Lloyd's List, which published a series of articles on the incident. And ultimately, the vessel that was identified was the Emerald, which transited the Suez Canal and left it on the 1st of February, pumping crude oil into Israeli waters within Israel's exclusive economic zone under the law of the sea in the early morning of the 2nd of February, and then traveling north to Banyas off the coast of Syria, where there is an oil refinery. That oil refinery is located at the end of a Trans-Arabian pipeline that comes from Kirkuk in northern Iraq, which is not operational at the moment due to the conflict in Syria. And in this map, you can see a series of red arrows. Those red arrows indicate signaling from the ship's automated identification system. So under the International Maritime Organization rules, ships are to have their AIS, their automated information systems, active all the time. But where you see there are no arrows, the ship was traveling dark. That is to say, it turned off the automatic ID. And throughout its journey upwards along the Israeli coast, it had its identification beacons off. And that would seem to also create suspicion as to the intentions. It then turned them on again when it came to the rendezvous, turned it off whilst it was passing northern Cyprus, perhaps to avoid Turkish or British intervention. And then the AIS signal is apparent again as it goes south back to enter the Suez Canal. The testing of the tar balls identified the chemical signature as being Iranian-sourced crude oil, and the vessel that it rendezvoused with was identified as the Lotus that had come out from the coast of Syria to receive the cargo. So next we look at this in the context of the grey zone war between Iran and Israel, which is multidimensional. On land, we have air-to-land targeting by Israel of Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps transfer of precision missile systems to Hezbollah. Its franchise in southern Lebanon, which is effectively an arm of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and has been assisting it in the war in Syria. Israeli planes have targeted those weapons transfers, and in response, Israel has targeted and attempted to target Israel where it can. There was a cyber attack on the Israeli water supply logistics system just under 2 years ago, and a covert limpet mine strike against the Israeli-owned vessel, the Helios Ray, on the 3rd of March last year, and then against the Hyperion Ray, a missile attack in April last year. And an Iranian vessel, the Saviz, was moored for the past 18 months in the Red Sea, where it was providing intelligence and material to the Houthi insurgency in Yemen, and also assisting in the targeting of third-party, I think, Saudi oil tankers. And in response to the attacks on the Helios Ray and the Hyperion Ray, Israel targeted the Saviz, that Iranian supply ship, on the 6th of April last year. And in response to that, in July, there was a drone attack by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps on the Zodiac Maritime, that is the Israeli Offer family operated Mercer Street vessel, which killed for the first time members on the ship, the captain and one member of the crew. But all of this is sheltered, covert, under a series of disguised operations, so that there's no attribution of responsibility in public international law. So that results in this being described as grey zone armed conflict, where there isn't any apparent attribution. Instead, pressure is applied on Iran and on Syria in the form of sanctions. The UN Security Council has imposed sanctions on trade in military material and nuclear technologies with Iran, but the USA and several other countries have imposed broader economic and secondary sanctions on trade, including in oil products, and similarly for Iran. And so the UK provides sanctions of the nature that were prior to Brexit imposed by the EU. Australia has oil sanctions that are more akin to the US that it applies. So thank you, Natasha. I won't spend too much time then on the intricacies of the shielding of the emerald, but suffice to say that it's owned by a company that is a shelf company in the Marshall Islands, which is owned by a company which is registered in Piraeus in Greece, which is owned by the Mullah family in Syria, which acts as agent for the Iranian government. So now we come to those criminal and civil liabilities that I heard you speaking of just now. That Israel has exercised its jurisdictional rights under the Law of the Sea Convention with an ordinance on seawater pollution prevention by oil, which imposes fines and civil liability for offences, but obviously it can't exercise that jurisdiction. It has no access to or control over the vessel or its crew. We don't know who the crew were, even for personal liability, and it would be difficult to exercise any form of jurisdiction over persons located in Iran or in Syria. There's an international treaty regime which provides for payment by ship owners, the civil liability on oil pollution convention, and an international fund that's contributed to by the consignees, the receivers of the oil cargo, which is the Oil Pollution Compensation Fund. And in July last year, the fund, since the owners of the vessel were not accessible, the fund provided or approved the provision of 50 million shekels compensation for cleanup costs to Israel. But the next question, and the main one I want to focus on, is that of liability for terrorism. It will never be provable that this was a terrorist act deliberately executed in order to intimidate and punish Israeli Jews by targeting their coastal environment. There are a series of 19 counterterrorism conventions at the global level, as well as a lot of regional counterterrorism conventions, and they address hijackings and attacks on civil aviation or maritime navigation, nuclear terrorism, taking of hostages and attacks on diplomats, and the use of bombings and plastic explosives, but none of them focus on the environment. So there is altogether neglect of the environment. Some of them address property. So if you're dealing with an aircraft or a ship, it's property that's protected, but the environment is not protected. So there's a treaty gap there. There's no general definition that covers the environment. There's no specific treaty that covers the environment. And as I pointed out at the beginning of this presentation, the most general definition we have is under the Financing Convention, which refers to death or serious bodily injury to a civilian. So that one doesn't even cover property, let alone the environment. A new kind of environmental crime has been proposed, which is called Ecocide, that I'll come to in a moment, but I'm going to suggest that more useful than that would be a new treaty on the suppression of acts against the environment, defined as acts that cause any significant destruction or degradation of the environment when the purpose is political coercion or intimidation. And as with the other counterterrorism conventions, it would be structured after having defined the particular sectoral kind of terrorism. It would oblige its parties to enact legislation that criminalizes such acts, to prosecute such acts, to provide each other with mutual legal assistance towards such prosecutions and extraditions towards such prosecutions. That's the normal pattern for counterterrorism conventions. And perhaps we should think about launching an initiative like that through something like a Stop Environmental Terror Foundation. There is, in fact, a Stop Ecocide Foundation funded by the Swedish government, which brought together a group of experts who have defined ecocide as a new crime, similar to a crime against humanity, but outside of the scope of armed conflict. So it's not a war crime, not a crime against humanity because it doesn't involve people, but a crime against the environment. And it's proposed as a third part to Article 8 of the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, and defines ecocide as unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment. So the burning of Jerusalem forests would come within that definition, where the persons coming from the West Bank, which is outside of Israeli jurisdiction, would automatically be regarded as widespread because it crosses national borders, and the acts are unlawful and cause severe damage. But you can see that this definition is broad and uncertain. And what's more, the International Criminal Court already has a record which is dubious, politicized, and demonstrates very poor effectiveness. What's more, when authority to prosecute is delegated to an international body with its inherent inbuilt UN political biases and mandate, there is only one Jewish state amongst the 194 states, the vast majority of whom have either membership in the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, that's 56 states, or are majority Christian states, and among those majority Roman Catholic, which don't recognize Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem, and there are a range of politics, let us say, that come through UN institutions and agencies, and that is true even in the area of the environment. So of the UN Environment Programme post-conflict environmental assessments that have been conducted, half of them focus on Jerusalem, the West Bank, or Gaza. The only others are Afghanistan, Haiti, Sudan, and South Sudan. But there are as many concerning Israel as there are all of those. And so I think it's an inevitability that giving jurisdiction to a political institution, even though it has the guise of a judicial body, will inevitably result in a political slant to the prosecution of ecocide, and that it would be more effective and fair and conventional for national legislation to apply and for states to cooperate in asserting their jurisdiction as they do under the Climate Change Convention, the Biodiversity Convention, the Counterterrorism Conventions. That is the usual and the natural model. So now we come to the conclusion. Ultimately, prevention of acts of environmental terrorism is better than cure, and we need legal clarity to recognize and identify and define environmental terrorism, to harmonize and put in place deterrent penalties, and then there's considerable scope for improvement in surveillance, emergency preparations, and international cooperation. The cooperation with REMPEC in relation to the coastal crude oil pollution worked well, but Israel was not aware of the spill until it actually reached its shores, despite the availability of satellite data. So there are a range of improvements that could be made. Now, the two pictures that we have here are of the Israeli coastal resort city of Eilat, known for its Red Sea corals, but it also has an oil terminal, and it receives cargo from about 5 ships a year. There's a proposal to increase that to 50 ships, utilizing the Europe-Asia Pipeline Company in a joint venture owned by the Med-Red land bridge under an agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates that would facilitate the movement of hydrocarbon products from the Persian Gulf through to Eilat, and then by pipeline across Israel and to Ashkelon for loading onto ships to take them further to destinations in Europe. And that would circumvent the Suez Canal, providing a supplement to it. Due to the fact that it takes a while to get through the canal, there are queues and occasional accidents. But this major redevelopment of Eilat as an oil terminal in a coral reef resort area is not only an accident waiting to happen, but also an environmental terrorism event waiting to happen. And we can remember the El Arish Ashkelon pipeline, which was continually sabotaged between in its transferring of natural gas between Israel and Egypt, and expect that the same thing would occur in the Gulf of Eilat. So there's a lot of hardening of targets and preventive work that can be done, but certainly legal clarity is necessary, first of all, to identify the problem that we're dealing with, to articulate it and come to common approaches. So I'll conclude by saying that environmental terrorism isn't an idea, it's a reality. It's occurring, unfortunately, in Israel in a multi-dimensional way. And a potential legal solution is to recognize and raise awareness and articulate it in an environmental terrorism convention that would be a convention on the suppression of unlawful acts against the environment. So I propose to you the establishment of a Stop Environmental Terror Foundation. Thank you very much for your time today, and I'm looking forward to taking your questions.
Well, Greg, thank you very much indeed for your presentation. We have had a lot of questions flowing in from the audience, but just to start off, could I pick up on a distinction you raised at the beginning of your presentation? You touched on the interaction between public international law, so law between states, and transnational law, national law applied in transboundary contexts. When dealing especially with this developing phenomenon of environmental terrorism, do you see perhaps the latter, the more established and perhaps easier to enforce form of national law is better able to grapple with this particular crime? Or do you think that public international law here also has an important?
Well, in our increasingly interconnected and globalized world, public international law always has a role to play. And in fact, the counterterrorism conventions are public international law, but they are conventions agreed between states under which states commit to apply their national laws. And that is generally more effective. States have far more in the way of resources and experience when it comes to prosecutions, and their pooled collaborative efforts are more effective in law enforcement cooperation than delegating to an international institution.
And we've heard your call to arms, as it were, at the end of your presentation. Do you see a will in the international community to address environmental terrorism, or is it simply the case that many countries are either uninterested or even opposed to a sort of initiative like this?
to oppose an initiative like this. It's a motherhood issue. Nobody would condone attacks on nature, on trees, on water for the purposes of political coercion. So I think that once awareness is raised, it's likely to be taken up as a serious issue. The main obstacle is that it's prevalently occurring in Israel against Israeli citizens, and therefore of less interest to states that haven't experienced the same attacks. So motivation normally occurs when there's a threat at home, rather than to a foreign small country such as Israel.
Following on from that, and I mean, I appreciate that many in our audience with an interest in the environment and law will have been following very closely the COP26 conference that was recently hosted in the United Kingdom. Are you aware of there being any focus at all in the context of that conference and the discussion on the environment that it occasioned, any focus on environmental terrorism? Of course, the point of climate change was very well publicized on the agenda. But if we were looking for a place to raise the profile of this phenomenon, a conference of that nature would perhaps be a prime example of where to have that discussion.
The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is about climate change. So the Conference of the Parties was concerned with implementing that convention, and although all elements of the environment are interconnected, the focus was on climate. There was no attention that I'm aware of given to environmental terrorism, which is a separate and distinct issue. The natural home of that issue is more likely to be the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, which deals with transnational crime, and that could be relevant. The other is the UN Environment Assembly, which is the universal membership body that oversees the global environment agenda and directs the UN Environment Programme. And both of those are useful fora within which to raise this issue for development. So the counter-terrorism conventions provided with secretariat services by the Office on Drugs and Crime, whereas a lot of the startup incubator thinking occurs within the UN Environment Programme and Environment Assembly. So I would have thought those are the places to raise.
We have had a question as to whether the UN Human Rights Council ought to be picking up the mantle on this issue, but as you've articulated, there are more appropriate or better placed organisations who could be doing more within the UN.
Agreed.
You mentioned, Greg, the possibility of this Stop Environmental Terror Foundation. We have had a question over whether environmental pressure groups like Greenpeace on an international scale have ever condemned environmental terrorism. And if not, is there any reason why they are so vocal on other environmental emissions? I mean, is it simply that there are not a sufficient number of Greenpeace activists who have experienced the fallout of the environmental terrorism that you've described, or are there any other reasons that it's not high enough on the priority of pressure groups?
Natasha, I was a child environmentalist at school, and then I chose a career in environmental law and international environmental law, and I've been doing it now for more decades than I want to admit. And I was not aware of these issues.
Right.
So I would be surprised if members of Greenpeace were.
We've, Greg, had a number of questions about the Emerald, and clearly this is an incident that raised the profile of environmental terrorism on the international agenda, and particularly with respect to Israel because of the severe impact it had. One question asks, why could the Emerald not be detained by port state control authorities in international ports? Have flag states taken any action against the owners or managers of the vessel, including the master of the vessel? And there's an assumption, this questioner acknowledges, that Iran would cooperate with this sort of activity. I mean, you've outlined in your presentation some of the real difficulties with tracing responsibility with respect to the emerald. But was there the possibility of any action being taken as this question is described?
I think the possibility is there in theory, but not the actual cooperation in reality. By the time the vessel was identified, we were 3 weeks or more after the discharge, by which time it had returned to Karg Island in Iran. It's a very simple matter for the vessel owner to change flag. So Panama, as the flag of the vessel, has responsibility to prosecute or to assist another country in the prosecution of a breach of laws applying to the vessel, laws which are harmonized under national laws through the International Maritime Organization's Convention on the Prevention of Pollution by Ships. So that sets out the various environmental and safety standards that are relevant and that states then implement. But because of the simplicity with which the flag can be changed, the name can be changed, and even the ownership under shelf companies can be changed, it's difficult to obtain any leverage over the vessel. The Emerald was owned by Emerald Marine. It's a one-ship shelf company. In fact, that's a common structure where a company is created specifically to own one vessel, and that's done to insulate other vessels owned by the company from being seized or used as collateral in a debt that's owed as a result of a pollution event.
If we park the attribution issues just for a moment, because we have had specifically a question that looks at war crimes, and it asks, as an act under the Iran-Israel armed conflict, is it a war crime, the Emerald incident, since there was no military benefit for this attack? Is there an alternative paradigm in which we might be able to look even at an incident like the Emerald in terms of the existing law and the old-fashioned war crimes framework that we...
Again, there is in theory, but not in practice. The first question is the grey zone armed conflict an armed conflict? The fact that it's described as a grey zone means that it's unclear, that it has reached the threshold that stretches beyond skirmishes to actual armed conflict, in which the laws of armed conflict would apply. If, hypothetically, we were to say that the laws of armed conflict do apply, then there are a series of state obligations at international law which are established within the International Criminal Court. These are now articulated in Article 8 on war crimes, paragraph 2b4, which defines a war crime as the causing of excessive incidental injury or damage, and then the elements of crime define excessive damage of the environment as widespread, long-term and severe damage to the natural environment, which would be clearly excessive in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage. So here it could be said that would be a war crime because you have widespread, long-term and severe damage, and it's unclear that there's any military advantage to what was done. But as you mentioned, there's the problem of attribution, and as I mentioned, there's the problem of defining this formally as an armed conflict. It also comes up under the principle of proportionality in Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, where damage to civilian objects and the environment would be categorized as civilian, where you're dealing with seashores and forests, which is excessive in relation to the military advantage is regarded as a war crime. The International Committee of the Red Cross has come up with a series of guidelines just in 2020, trying to clarify the meaning of these provisions on protection of the natural environment in armed conflict. And those, although the International Committee of the Red Cross seeks to expand and strengthen their scope, nevertheless, the 32 rules that are set out are quite sensible and would likely apply if attribution and armed conflicts were apparent, but they're just not in a practical sense.
And of course, the other key issue that you've highlighted with promoting accountability for environmental terrorism is the international will and the international acknowledgement of this as an issue. Bearing that in mind, and this is the final question that I'll put to you, one individual asks, what should concerned members of the public or grassroots organisations do to push governments to do something effective to address these issues? Is there anything in particular and practical that members of our audience who feel this keenly can be taking upon themselves?
Question. Thank you. We've got a ready-made answer, which is the model that's already been established by the Stop Ecocide Foundation. So they created a commission of experts. They came up with a report. They have a formula, and that has been publicized and is being promoted in multiple fora by the multinational members of that commission. They've got funding from a government, from the Swedish government, to promote this as an issue. That's a formula, and it's one that, although it would take many years to crystallize in a new international legal agreement, nevertheless puts us on the road there.
Formula that our audience now have, and thanks to your incredibly detailed presentation, they, I am sure, will be far better informed than the majority of environmental campaigners and environmental lawyers, unfortunately, operating in this space currently. I'm tremendously grateful for you taking the time, especially so early in the morning in Australia. And with our technical difficulties, we managed to see them all through. Thank you so much, Greg. And hopefully see you next time for another presentation on international law with UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust.